Today we're going to be talking about how you can go beyond the standard uh, boundaries that you're used to with policy and extend your security perimeter using that policy out to areas you previously couldn't. So with that, I just wanted to bring up that this is not a simple task. You know, I liken it and jokingly say it's like herding cats or nailing jello to the wall. And what I mean by that is that there's all these new regulations that come in. You get new employees move around. You get those typical security lifecycle events for what we in IAM call joiners, movers, and leavers. And with that, you know, you have to maintain who gets access to what and what sort of activities they can do. But there's also some new lenses to look at security. And I know as I talk to people, you know, we're used to talking about identity and access management for our internal users and the devices that they use, but we'll see that we really go beyond that. And a new category, or at least a category that's really come into attention in regards to securing things and locking it down, are these ephemeral connections and services. So, you know, just to give you an example, you've got a container that has to spin up to support a database product or, you know, your web front end.
Oh,
And
would that also apply to things like AWS instances or Azure instances, something like that?
yeah, that's a great point because things live in the cloud. And as we talk about extending our boundaries here, that's a perfect example. And it falls within the ephemeral connections and services because people will spin up a container or a VM in AWS or Azure, and you know they'll need to put security around that. And one of the ways you can do that is with policy, and I'll show you what that means. But that was a great question. The other thing that warrants pointing out here on this page is shadow IT. And I know this industry, security, and particularly identity and access management, has talked about this shadow IT of people using things like Dropbox and things. It really hasn't abated at all.
Hmm.
In other words, people are finding new and interesting ways to work around corporate policy or restrictions that get put in place just so they can get their jobs done.
Right.
You know, I don't think it's most of the time it's not for an evil purpose. Most of the time it's, you know, how quickly can I get somebody a file or something? But you have to be aware of that, and policy has to accommodate for that.
Yeah,
So
I could see that. I mean, I know some organizations allow you to do that, but then there are other organizations that have really strict policies around that and have ways of even preventing you from downloading things like that. So it does depend on the organization and what their policies are
absolutely.
around that, their culture.
Absolutely. And
Mhm.
we'll talk about that. And this next point here about establishing a baseline, you know, I kind of mentioned it in the previous one that it's not just about regulatory compliance. It's also about corporate policy and best
Mhm.
practices. But I want to talk about, you know, what you're used to managing. People are pretty confident and aware that you need to manage your employees. That's pretty common. But you know, over time we've seen it used to be these external partners and contractors didn't really have access, but over time we've had to add these people in and provide them access. But going beyond that, you know, applications can use an identity now, and those services, you know, you brought up AWS and Azure. Those often require an identity to access something on-prem if you're pulling data, you know, across that bridge that gets you to the cloud, or you know sometimes they have data that
Right.
you really want to pull back onto your um,
I,
on-premise. Yeah,
it will, but with applications and services. Oh, and then you also say about devices and BYOD, those tend to also be attack vectors. So I've heard of companies that have so many instances spun in a cloud, and they kind of are either A, still paying for it and not using it, or B, didn't know it was out there, didn't have a way of, a proper way of tracking them. And then it
Mhm.
just turns out that they can, that is an access point or a vector in which a breach can occur.
Exactly right. And what's interesting is there are all these attack vectors, and I'll continue on
Yeah.
with IoT based things and even customers.
Mm.
You used to have to just manage one aspect of identities, and now the mixture of all these means that if any of them have elevated privileges, you put yourself in a position where it could be compromised and it could be used against you. And that's what we want to do with policy, is try and limit that as much as possible. So as we talk about what I like to abbreviate as AuthN and Authz, that's authentication and authorization. Back in the earlier days when the world was pretty small, we had Active Directory, a bunch of users, and what we did was we moved users into groups and managed those groups so that we could control Amy's part of marketing, so she gets access to the marketing cloud and marketing data. And then I don't have to manage Amy's individual privileges. If you move on, as you get promoted to VP and CMO, you'll get more privileges, but some of your lower level privileges might get moved. Maybe you're not running those daily reports or something. So it's easier for me to manage those within a group and manage the group. So then we had this evolution, of managing Windows devices, and in comes Linux, both
Mm.
on-prem and in the cloud, and running SaaS apps and other things like that didn't play well within this space. So, having a way to bring everybody in and manage all the users through Active Directory gives you full support of that lifecycle management and still lets you access those remote resources, those Linux boxes that exist. And yes, Amy, even out in Azure and AWS at
Yes, yeah.
Google. So I'm really glad you brought that up, because
Hmm.
that's a big problem that people haven't gotten their handles around.
Right. That makes sense, actually. And having worked for SUSE Linux Enterprise, I do remember they had great partnership with Microsoft in trying to solve some of that stuff. So it's nice you can manage it through Active Directory. It is the major directory most organizations use, correct?
Yes,
Okay.
yes. A great question. It's in the order of 95% of the
Okay.
Fortune 1000 still maintain and use Active Directory, and group policy on top of it.
Okay.
So, you know, as we move on and talk about the life cycle events for users and computers, some of the things that are probably rote for a lot of our people listening to the presentation, but I'll still walk through it, and I'll try to be fairly succinct here. Couple of things you're managing. You're obviously managing users and computers or devices or VMs or whatever, but the point I want to make here is, we talked about moving people into groups. You can actually use this to help you clean up Active Directory, clean up your other methods of access, and bring everybody in instead of assigning people directly to resources. So I gave an example here of me getting assigned to manage a web server. The better way to do that is to put me in a group, and sometimes you have to create these groups on your own, move them into web server admin so that you can clean this up as much as possible. Same sort of thing with computers. And as we put policy into place, you'll see that nesting is included in this. So as I create the overall marketing organization, and then I can create North America-based marketers, and I can even create marketers based in the Bay Area,
Oh,
and
nice.
have a subset of privileges that just apply to you. And I know we're getting a little off track here talking about how to best manage users. I'm just saying the methodology you're used to in managing on-premise Windows devices and users can now be expanded to Linux boxes, Unix boxes, Mac, non-domain join Windows. And that really is the thrust of what we're trying to say here is a process that you're familiar with for managing users, computers, and other devices can be now extended to create a security perimeter that reaches far beyond what you're used to for on-premise Windows and Windows devices.
Oh, nice. Okay.
One quick point on the bottom here is policy applies automatically. So as I put policy in place for those marketers in San Francisco, as people join that, they automatically get the access policies and all the parent policies that go along with that. Same sort of thing for resources, VMs, containers, new computers. Policy will populate automatically. So you won't feel the urgent need to, as soon as you spin up a new VM or add a new computer, that you better go lock things down, because policy is watching out for you, and policy always wins. And policy will immediately take effect once that computer, that user becomes part of the groups that we talked about. And what does that look like? I wanted to just show a screenshot of parent and child. Here we see some Windows components down to an internet control panel, security page. These are just some of the policies that are set. And you see this kind of parent-child relationship. So hopefully that comes across. Does that make sense to you?
It does, and it sounds to me like it also saves a lot of time for IT administrators, because if you can sort of, if I spin something up or I have a new person on my team, all of that quickly gets applied automatically. And so it sounds like it saves quite a bit of just manual work trying to set up policies for every instance or every person.
Right. And one of the key things it does is it avoids human mistakes. So, if you had to go set up 1,000 things every time you started a new computer, what are the chances you're going to miss one or two of those as you do these over and over and over again? Where policy is programmatic, so it says apply these 1,000 settings to this computer. So we talked a little bit about authentication and authorization, and that's a good way to start to think about how you can extend your security policies so that you can give people access to the resources they need to do their job. And I think that makes sense, and I feel pretty good about that. But you can go beyond authentication and authorization to really set a bunch of settings that are appropriate for whatever resource you're managing. So I mentioned Macintosh, I mentioned Linux and Unix, non-domain join Windows, and you brought up whether they exist in the cloud or on-prem, and you may have some different settings based on those. So I like to talk about the different policy silos that people have and may not realize that they're either not managing or are under managing. So everybody knows we've been talking about Active Directory group policy, but there's also, when you have Azure, you have Intune, and sometimes if you don't have Azure, you have some other mobile device management or MDM solution that you want to manage people's BYOD devices. Same sort of thing for VMware. There's a policy package around VMware. You want to manage the cloud resources in AWS, Azure, Google Cloud Platform. And then you can even put policy around SaaS applications and services. I'll give you an example as we move forward here and talk about making security and compliance simpler to manage.
I was going to ask about compliance because I'm guessing that there are a lot of mandates or, corporate mandates or industry regulations that require a little bit more fine-grained policy for various types of things that are your authorizations are.
Yes, absolutely. And it used to be that you had to go out to individual people. So, you could go to your Active Directory guy and say, get me a report of compliance with some of the more common privacy and security things, say GDPR or CCPA, or maybe you want to do, your retail corporation and you want to cover PCI DSS so that you can take credit cards, you go out to your individual resource owners. Hey, VMware guy. Hey, Active Directory guy, give me a report. And, being able to pull that in and manage it from a single pane of glass is really where you get the benefits of extending the security policy.
Nice.
So we talked about the security lifecycle. I already covered those ephemeral resources, but resources do move around. I mentioned you getting promoted to VP of marketing and then becoming CMO, and I'm sure we'll see that soon. But resources, more typically VMs or people's computers as they travel, as we get back to travel, people will plug in at different places or join different things and they'll move around. Policy should adjust to that, and it supports that life cycle. So policy does support that. As you mentioned, it really is a time saver, and it's much easier to maintain because you've got one place to go to adjust for changes in regulation and policy. And then you get kind of a feedback loop. So you see the policy that I put in place, I limited some people so they couldn't access something. I had to go make an adjustment to that. Let me feed that back into policy so that I can improve policy and continue to fine-tune policy over the basic one you set out to begin with. Right. And then I got a point here to talk about temporary solutions because, as you move into your chief marketing officer role and Amy becomes CMO of Micro Focus, you may take a vacation and have to delegate that somebody needs access to something to do while you're on vacation.
Nice.
Policy supports the solution. Policy supports a solution where you could assign Rob to go take over your activities temporarily, and then when you come back, we can adjust those back so you get them and Rob no longer gets them.
Well, I appreciate you thinking of me in that situation.
Absolutely. Last point on this slide is that policy management, so the act of pulling policy into a centralized management platform like we have with Universal Policy Administrator, gives you things like version control and workflows so that as I make changes to policy that's going to affect the company, somebody's going to review that before we actually roll that out to production. And if I by chance make a mistake, I have the capability to say, you know what, something broke, let me just roll back to the previous version so that I can get everybody back to how we were before, and I'll go back and make my adjustments later. So let's talk about how people are managing policies today. I mentioned that a lot of people, a large portion, as you brought up, a large portion of the Fortune 1000 people are still using Active Directory and group policy. This is the one that most people are familiar with. And we kind of built on that experience in UPA of giving you all the benefits that I talked about, the version control, the workflow, the approval pieces, the reporting. We've taken that model that people have used with Active Directory and group policy and extended that out to Linux, Unix, Mac, out in the cloud, on-premise, regardless of where it lives, we'll cover it all. So if you're familiar with that, you get that uniform user experience. You get tighter security that applies automatically as resources move around. And you end up saving a lot of cost and a lot of time because you're not managing individual resources and moving things around on your own. Does that make sense?
Yeah, it does. It does. It sounds like it's a really great time saver. And of course, like you said, people don't need to make mistakes, but it happens. And that's usually how a company becomes exposed. So this is nice.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. Yeah. And this is just a visual representation of managing Active Directory on-premise, and people added Linux servers and kept them within their security perimeter and area of control. And there's even some Active Directory bridging products that cover this for you and makes it feel very native and comfortable. We have one as well. But what you really want is something that's going to cover those Linux boxes in the cloud, Unix, Windows, whatever exists out there, so that you can expand your security perimeter and put everything under that sphere of control regardless where it lives. And then you write policy over the whole thing, and you're able to put controls on things that previously you were unable to. So as we talk about that security perimeter, I kind of built this little kernel of where we started with on-premise Windows, and then we added Linux, and then we reached out to the cloud and managed Windows, Mac, and Linux. And Universal Policy Administrator and AD Bridge both support extending out to SaaS apps and cloud services, and ultimately even out to the mini sensors as we look to write agents that can go either on the IoT gateways or even down to the individual sensors and devices with TinyOS and those sorts of things. So we're really looking at kind of the left side of the slide here, implementing a policy management framework that works, that people are familiar with, that gives you monitoring capabilities for when changes happen to policy or somebody goes outside policy. And if they do go outside policy, policy supports a mechanism for enforcement. So even if I give you absolute rights, Amy, and you're chief marketing officer and you should have rights to go make security changes on any resource we have, if it's working outside of what we've defined as policy for either regulatory control or our on-premise corporate policy for security, policy will enforce that we keep things like ports closed. And if you go in and make a change, even though you have rights, policy will override that because, as I said previously, policy always wins. And that enforcement mechanism will mean that you not only get secure, but you stay secure and you know who's setting you up to potentially be insecure. And you can go talk. I could come back to you and say, Amy, don't do that. You'll open up ports and people will get access to our data, and we don't want to do that.
No, I don't want that to happen either. I might not be the CMO anymore.
Yeah, exactly. So, I've kind of touched on a bunch of these benefits here, but I threw a screenshot in here to show you exactly what that looks like. And as we look at the left side of the slide, I'm not going to read these things. Probably the thing I wanted to make apparent through our discussion here today is the policy mechanisms that people are used to with Active Directory can now be extended out beyond those standard boundaries that people are used to. And we put enterprise practices in place around the workflow, the approval, the double checking, the enforcement, all the things you see along the left side on the benefits are really something that go beyond, just the standard on-premise Windows policy management. So hopefully that makes sense.
Yeah, it does. It's nice.
So a couple other benefits that didn't fit on those slides that I thought were worth celebrating. I mentioned the offline management. You can also do some what-if scenarios. I mentioned the backup and restore. There's notifications all along the way. So if I make a change to policy and you're my manager, before I'll roll that out, you'll get the approval workflow, but you'll also get a notification through email. So it's not like you have to live in the tool to see all the changes going on. And then that version control as well.
Nice.
There's also methods built into the product to help you do some delegation. So if I want to delegate somebody to just manage policy for that office in San Francisco that does marketing, we can do that. And then it fully supports change management process. And then there's some reporting pieces. And I'll touch on this in a couple upcoming slides and some examples here. I did want to mention that, everybody's familiar with Active Directory group policy and is pretty comfortable with what we do. You do have these unmanaged or undermanaged resources, as I mentioned before. You may be doing some management of Linux and Unix, but it's outside of what you're doing there, and you've kind of got multiple pieces there. And then there's the non-domain join windows. So those can't, without something like AD Bridge or Universal Policy Administrator, they can't accept the policy, so you have to manage it on its own. And containers and, to a lesser degree, IoT are certainly hot topics that, as I go around talking to people about policy, these things come up often. So what we've done is create universal policy administrators so that we can suck in all these policies from a bunch of different silos and bring them to a centralized point and a single pane of glass so that it's comfortable for people. If you know the Active Directory group policy methodology, this will feel very comfortable for you. So it gives you that same sort of feeling, but still layers on those enterprise features that we talked about, the backup, the what if scenario, the reporting scenario. And I think that's where we want to go next, is to talk to people about, how easy it is to get going with some very simple policy management. So if you go beyond Active Directory group policy and use a product like Universal Policy Administrator, it will suck in all the policies from all the different silos that we talked about and allow you to extend policy to those new endpoints, the Linux, the Mac, all those other things that we talked about. Also along the lines of best practices is a way to build containers that match your structure. So that structure I showed in the screenshot of group policy, you can build out a structure like that at UPA that includes things like cloud, Linux-based in the cloud, Linux-based on AWS, Linux-based web servers on AWS. And using a product like UPA, you can build the core policies and then test them over and over. Is this what I want? Is this what I expect when Amy goes in to manage a server in AWS on Linux? What does that look like?
So, and also, can I just clarify? So you're
Yeah.
saying that if you're an AD administrator and you're used to using it in a certain way, just as it pertains to users, what Universal Policy Administrator can do is help do that in a way that's familiar in terms of the experience and how you
Right.
go and set those forth. So there's
Well,
a low learning curve on it, right?
Yes, I really like the way you put that, because the procedure for managing policy is going to be very familiar to those AD administrators.
Right.
But remember I mentioned delegation before?
Mm.
So I could delegate policy management for my Linux experts on all Linux boxes. I'm not saying the AD guy has to learn Linux and learn how to tighten things down and make sure we lock down all the ports. The process of managing policy can be done and is familiar to AD group policy administrators. But you can delegate to your application or OS experts or security experts on, say, Salesforce or something like that you want to manage with policy. So, don't think that all the benefits go to the AD group policy administrators. That process will be familiar with them, but then they can delegate to their technology experts.
Okay, that makes sense. Okay.
Yeah. So as you're going through and setting up your simple start for policy management, you set up basic policy and then you increase the sophistication of policy by either adjusting one existing policy and creating a larger monolithic policy, or you can, because policy is additive, you can add little pieces to policy. So just on, those marketing servers in San Francisco or all marketing servers, I can create policy that flows down from all resources at Micro Focus down to a very specific number of resources and put policy all at every junction in between so that policy adds to create a more effective policy that's easier to manage and simple to generate reports for. And that kind of brings us to the end. So hopefully I've given you a good idea of how you can take something that you're familiar with, managing Active Directory group policies, use that same process to extend out to resources that were previously undermanaged or unmanageable, and bring them into the policy management fold for that simple policy lifecycle, the monitoring that goes on, and then the enforcement that happens. So
yes, thank you. Thank you very much, Tim. I really learned a lot. I appreciate it. Thank you.
Well, thank you, Amy. You had some great questions, and I really like the way you kind of focused me on talking about real world problems that we hear from customers. So
excellent.
Thank you.
Okay.